The email arrived at 9:15 in the morning, an island of brutal simplicity in a sea of complex data streams. The subject line was just 2 words: strategic restructuring. The body was even more sparse. Boardroom, 10 a.m., mandatory attendance. That was it. No attached agenda, no clarifying context, just a digital summons that felt less like a professional courtesy and more like a blade being quietly sharpened in the next room. For 7 years, my life had been a meticulously planned symphony of formulas, controlled reactions, and predictable outcomes. I was a scientist. I did not do well with unknown variables, especially when they were delivered with such cold, corporate finality. My company, my world, was Veridian Structures. I had built it from a single, revolutionary idea nurtured in the sterile, hopeful environment of a university petri dish: bioconcrete. It sounded simple, but it was magic. A building material that could heal its own fractures, that literally breathed in carbon dioxide from the poison city air, and through a biological process I had spent a decade perfecting, exhaled cleaner, purer oxygen. It was a living thing, an extension of my own DNA, my very soul rendered in aggregate and catalyst. I looked around my lab, my true home. The air hummed with the gentle, constant whir of climate controllers and the faint, organic smell of wet earth and setting composites. Sunlight, clean and white, streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Palo Alto headquarters, illuminating the microscopic dust motes dancing over prototypes that looked like pieces of abstract, brutalist sculpture. This was my sanctuary, my kingdom. I was Myra Townsend, the founding head of research and development, and the undisputed beating heart of this company. I held a belief, one that I now recognize as a form of foolish, academic sincerity, that genuine innovation for a sustainable future was a currency that could never be devalued. More foolishly, I believed in the unwavering loyalty of my mentor, Julian Croft. Julian was the seasoned business professor who had seen the raw genius in my graduate thesis. He had plucked me from obscurity, taught me how to speak the language of venture capital, and helped me turn a wild scientific dream into a nearly billion-dollar enterprise. He was more of a father to me than my own distant, perpetually disappointed father had ever been. I trusted him completely. I handed him the business side, the legal minutiae, the entire corporate architecture, so that I could be free to do what I did best: create. My mistake, a fatal one, was thinking that being indispensable meant that I was safe. As I made the long walk from the research wing to the executive floor, the plush carpet silencing my footsteps, I tried to rationalize the nervous flutter in my stomach. It had to be the Omni Group deal. Of course. We had been courting the massive construction conglomerate for over a year, and Julian had hinted last week that we were on the verge of a breakthrough. This sudden, mandatory meeting had to be the grand announcement, the moment we would secure our legacy and change the face of global construction forever. The moment I pushed open the heavy, polished oak door to the boardroom, the optimistic air in my lungs turned to ice. This was not a celebration. This was an ambush. The investors, men I knew and had pitched to for years, were arranged around the mahogany table like statues, their faces carved from cold, unfeeling stone. Julian was at the far end, his back partially to me, his entire focus trained on a single, sweating glass of water as if it held the answers to the universe. He refused to meet my eyes. That was the first cut. The second and more damning piece of evidence was the man sitting in the chairman's seat, the seat Julian and I always shared at these meetings. He was a stranger, dressed in a bespoke suit so sharp and dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. He possessed the polished, unnerving calm of a great white shark that knows it is the apex predator in the water. "Myra, thank you for joining us," Julian said, and the sound of his voice was a strained, unfamiliar thing, the voice of a hostage reading a script. "This is Arthur Vance." Arthur Vance bestowed upon me a smile that was a masterpiece of corporate insincerity. It did not come close to reaching his eyes. His eyes were cold, active things, like twin calculators, assessing my worth, my threat level, and finding both manageable. "A pleasure to finally meet the mind behind the miracle material," he said, his voice as smooth as silk, but with the tensile strength of steel cable. What followed was a 10-minute masterclass in corporate assassination, delivered with bloodless precision. Julian, stumbling over words that had clearly been written for him, announced that Arthur Vance, a professional CEO brought in from Silicon Valley, was taking over Veridian Structures. Arthur's reputation preceded him. He was a corporate flipper, a man famous for acquiring promising tech companies, stripping them for parts, and selling off the carcass for a tidy profit. He was not a builder, he was a demolition expert. The change was effective immediately. Julian, my mentor, my partner, was being kicked upstairs to the purely ceremonial role of chairman of the board. The official reason, Julian mumbled, was that the company needed a seasoned leader to navigate its next phase of aggressive global expansion. A new head of R&D had already been hired, a rising star from MIT named Dr. Leo Martinez, who was apparently lauded for his skill in commercializing complex research. My research. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold tide pulling away from my skin. I stared at Julian, my eyes pleading with him to stop this, to tell me it was some kind of elaborate, sick joke. He just continued his intense study of the condensation on his water glass, his silence a deafening roar of betrayal. Then came the final, exquisitely crafted insult. I wasn't being fired. That would have been too clean, too merciful, and it would have triggered a generous severance package. No, I was being reassigned. My new title, Arthur Vance announced with another of his empty smiles, was Senior Lab Consultant, a meaningless, powerless role designed to sideline and humiliate me. My team, the brilliant scientists I had personally mentored, would now report to Leo. My active projects were now his. My lab, my beautiful, humming sanctuary, was now his. As a final flourish, my salary was cut by 2/3. In the space of 10 minutes, I had been demoted from the soul of the company to a ghost, doomed to haunt the very halls I had built. Why? The word escaped my lips, barely a whisper, a fragile sound in the heavy, oppressive silence. Arthur Vance leaned forward, the pretense of friendliness dropping away completely, revealing the cold predator beneath. Your 20% founding equity, Ms. Townsend, is an impediment to future investment rounds. It makes our cap table look untidy. The board feels it is time to redistribute that value more strategically. They weren't just taking my job, they were taking my creation, my financial future, my entire professional identity. They were methodically, systematically erasing me. And Julian, the man who had looked me in the eye 100 times and promised to always protect me and my creation, sat there and allowed it to happen. His silence wasn't just complicity, it was the cruelest cut of all. I will need to have my lawyer review this, I said, my voice shaking, not with fear, but with a rage so pure and hot it was slowly burning through the shock. Arthur's chilling smile returned. Of course, but I think you'll find your employment contract is quite clear. All inventions and intellectual property created during your tenure are the exclusive property of Viridian Structures. You are, for all intents and purposes, entirely locked out. He believed he had me in a cage of his own design. He believed he had won. He and Julian and all the silent, complicit men in that room had forgotten something vital. They had forgotten that long before I was a scientist, I was the daughter of a research librarian. I was raised in the quiet, dusty stacks of a university library, and I was taught one inviolable rule: read everything. Read every page, every footnote, every appendix. Especially the fine print. As I walked out of that boardroom, my heels clicking on the marble floor, the world of Viridian Structures suddenly feeling alien and hostile, a memory surfaced. A dusty, 7-year-old memory. It was of a stuffy, cramped lawyer's office and a kind, elderly law professor who was advising university startups pro bono. He had admired my youthful, scientific idealism, but had warned me, with a sad smile, about the sharks who swam in the corporate oceans. And he had helped me write something. A single, elegant, and powerfully destructive clause. A secret key, buried so deep in the mountain of Viridian's foundational legal documents that I was sure even Julian had forgotten it ever existed. A time bomb, waiting patiently for 7 years for the perfect moment to be activated. They had just handed me the detonator. They thought they had turned me into a powerless, humiliated consultant. They had no idea they had just given me a front-row seat to their own meticulously planned self-destruction. The profound grief of betrayal was already beginning to cool, to harden into something else. Something cold, sharp, and infinitely patient. A plan began to form, not in my head, but in my gut. It was a slow, controlled reaction, the kind I knew best. I would play their game. I would become the quiet, cooperative ghost they wanted me to be. And from the shadows, I would dismantle their stolen empire, brick by brick, using the very material I had once loved. This was no longer about simple revenge. This was about reclamation. The first phone call I made after leaving that boardroom was not to my mother to cry, nor to a friend for comfort. It was to Evelyn Reed. Evelyn's name was spoken in hushed, fearful tones in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley. She was a legal predator in a flawlessly tailored pantsuit, a notorious intellectual property lawyer who took a special, almost artistic delight in eviscerating corporate bullies. I'd met her at a Women in STEM conference several years prior. She had listened to my passionate presentation on bioconcrete, then handed me her card with a knowing, cynical smile. "Call me when they try to screw you," she'd said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. They always do. I sat in her minimalist, top-floor office, the San Francisco skyline a cold, geometric backdrop behind her. The silence in the room was absolute as I laid out the whole sordid story, from the email summons to Julian's averted gaze to Arthur Vance's triumphant smirk. When I finished, she didn't offer a word of sympathy. She offered a wolfish grin. "Let me guess," she said, steepling her long fingers, her dark eyes gleaming with intellectual hunger. "They confidently cited the standard IP assignment clause in your employment contract as their kill shot." "Word for word," I confirmed, feeling the first spark of hope ignite in the cold void of my shock. Arthur Vance was very proud of it. "Arrogant men always are," she mused, her voice a low purr. "They read the first page of the corporate playbook and assume the game is already over. Now, tell me, Myra, did you do what that old professor told you to do all those years ago?" In response, I slid a slim, unassuming folder across the vast expanse of her glass desk. "I did more than that. I filed the core patent for the catalyst agent separately, under my personal name, a full 6 months before Viridian Structures was even officially incorporated. Then, I licensed its use to the company." Evelyn opened the folder. Her eyes, sharper and more precise than any laser, scanned the dense pages of legal text. They moved with a speed that was almost inhuman. Then she stopped. She had found it. A single, highlighted paragraph on page 73 of the Series A funding agreement, buried deep within a section on miscellaneous provisions. Her grin widened into something truly predatory. "Myra, this is beautiful. This is not a legal document. This is a work of art." I had named it the Eden Clause, a small piece of private poetry I'd insisted on embedding in the dry, lifeless prose of the contract. It stated, in perfectly clear and legally binding language, that Viridian Structures had the non-exclusive right to use the proprietary biological catalyst that was the secret ingredient, the very heart, of bioconcrete. That catalyst was what allowed the material to self-heal and sequester carbon. Without it, bioconcrete was just concrete. The clause stipulated, however, a single critical condition. Should I, Myra Townsend, be removed from my executive role in research and development, or any substantially equivalent position, without my express written consent, 2 things would happen instantaneously. First, the non-exclusive license would immediately and irrevocably be revoked. Second, all rights to the catalyst, past, present, and future, would revert exclusively to me. Julian, in his haste and self-congratulatory arrogance to secure that first round of funding, had signed it without a second thought. It was just one more page in a mountain of paperwork he'd likely never read. "They've already triggered it," Evelyn stated, her voice humming with the thrill of the hunt. "The moment they named a new head of R&D and officially demoted you to that insulting consultant title, they broke the covenant. Which means," she paused for dramatic effect, "every single batch of bioconcrete they have manufactured since 10:30 this morning constitutes a willful and prosecutable patent infringement. The plan we devised was simple, and its sheer simplicity was its strength. I would not resign in a blaze of fury. I would not file a lawsuit and get bogged down in years of costly litigation. Not yet. I would accept my new role. I would become the most cooperative, most defeated, most utterly broken senior lab consultant they had ever seen. I would watch from the inside. I would document everything. And I would let them build their glittering tower of ambition on a foundation of technology they had stolen, not knowing it was already poisoned. The higher they climbed, the more spectacular the fall would be. Returning to Viridian, the next day was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Walking through the doors felt like passing through a portal into a hostile, alien world. The lab, once my sanctuary of creation, now felt like a mausoleum haunted by the ghost of my own career. My former team members, scientists I had hired and mentored, couldn't bring themselves to look me in the eye. Their faces were a painful mixture of pity, confusion, and fear for their own jobs. The new boss, Dr. Leo Martinez, was exactly the kind of scientist I most despised. He was all ambitious theory and flashy credentials, with none of the hands-on, dirt-under-the-fingernails passion that true innovation requires. He treated my lab like a new toy he had just unwrapped, and me like a piece of obsolete, pre-installed software. "Myra," he said on his first day, not even bothering to make eye contact as he scrolled imperiously through a tablet that contained all of my life's research. "I'm going to need a full and immediate handover of the catalyst production protocols. I have some optimization ideas I'd like to implement." "Of course, Leo," I said, my voice a perfect, carefully constructed imitation of weary resignation. I provided him with the surface-level operating procedures, the ones we used for training new lab technicians. When he pushed for more granular data, for the core variables that govern the delicate biological synthesis, I cited the labyrinthine biosafety protocols that I myself had written years ago. He was too arrogant, too convinced of his own superior intellect to question it. He wanted to believe that he could reverse engineer my creation, that he could improve upon my life's work. I was more than happy to let him try and fail. For 2 agonizing months, I played my part to perfection. I fetched coffee. I calibrated equipment for Leo's increasingly frustrated and consistently failed experiments. I sat silently in meetings while he presented my data as his own. I watched him try and fail to replicate the catalyst's delicate biological synthesis. He couldn't grasp that it wasn't just a chemical formula. It was a living process, an ecosystem in miniature that I had nurtured and perfected through thousands of iterations. Meanwhile, Arthur Vance was on a corporate victory tour, giving glowing interviews to business magazines about Viridian, new, aggressive, and streamlined vision. He and Julian hosted lavish dinners for investors and potential partners, where they presented my research, my PowerPoint slides, and my innovation as the fruits of their bold new leadership. All the while, I was documenting. My security access, though reduced, still allowed me entry to the company's production servers. Every evening, after everyone else had gone home, I would quietly copy production logs for the catalyst, shipping manifests for every order of bioconcrete, sales contracts with new clients. Every single file was another nail hammered into their corporate coffin, irrefutable proof that they were manufacturing and selling a product they no longer had any legal right to produce. I forwarded everything to Evelyn in heavily encrypted files, building our case piece by meticulous piece. The absolute peak of their hubris, the pinnacle of their stolen glory, came in the form of the Oasis Tower. It was to be their magnum opus, a breathtaking $500 million skyscraper in Dubai built entirely from bioconcrete, a gleaming green symbol of their success. The press conference to announce it was planned as a global media event. Government officials from the UAE, world-renowned architects, and the heads of international investment funds were all scheduled to attend. This single project was their key to securing multi-billion-dollar government contracts and a stratospheric new valuation for the company. It was also the perfect stage for their public execution. The day before the event, with the entire company buzzing with triumphant energy, Evelyn Reed made her move. She didn't file a lawsuit. That would be too slow, too conventional. Instead, she sent a single, devastating letter via sworn international courier. Copies were delivered simultaneously to every member of the Viridian Board of Directors, to the managing partners of their primary investment firms, and, most importantly, to the lead developers of the Oasis Tower project in Dubai. It was a formal, and legally terrifying, cease and desist notice. The letter calmly and clinically explained that Viridian Structures had been illegally and willfully infringing on United States Patent number 7,824,512, the patent for the core biological catalyst, since 10:30 a.m. on the date of my demotion. It detailed, with precise legal citations, how the Eden Clause in their own signed funding agreement had been irrevocably triggered. It demanded the immediate cessation of all production, sales, and use of bioconcrete worldwide. And it concluded by stating that any public announcement suggesting the future use of the material, such as the one planned for the following day in Dubai, would be considered a willful and malicious violation of the patent holder's rights, inviting immediate legal action for punitive damages that would bankrupt the company 10 times over. My phone started ringing almost immediately. It was Julian, his voice frantic on the voicemail. Then Arthur, his message a string of furious, impotent threats. Then the company's terrified general counsel. I let them all go to voicemail. I sat in my small, quiet apartment, watching the sunset paint the Silicon Valley sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. A profound sense of quiet, controlled calm settled over me. The trap had been sprung. The first, critical brick had been pulled from their foundation. Now all I had to do was wait and watch the tower fall. The fallout was not a slow, creeping decay. It was a sudden, violent demolition. The news of the last-minute, unexplained cancellation of the Oasis Tower press conference hit the global financial newswires like a seismic shockwave. Veridian's official statement, a masterfully vague piece of corporate doublespeak about unforeseen contractual complications, fooled absolutely no one. In the cutthroat world of international finance, such language was a blaring siren signaling a catastrophe of the highest order. The stock of their primary construction partner, the publicly traded Omni Group, plummeted by a staggering 12% in pre-market trading, erasing nearly $1 billion of value in a matter of minutes. The media, smelling the rich, coppery scent of blood in the water, began to dig with a frenzied, piranha-like intensity. My name, the name that Arthur Vance and Julian Croft had worked so diligently to erase from Veridian's corporate history, was suddenly everywhere. The narrative was simply too compelling, too perfectly dramatic to resist. The brilliant, cast-aside female founder, unceremoniously pushed out by her greedy male counterparts, now holding their entire billion-dollar global enterprise hostage with a secret legal kill switch she had cleverly planted years before. Arthur Vance, in a final, predictable act of breathtaking arrogance, attempted to brazen it out. He hastily arranged an emergency all-hands meeting, a global video conference broadcast to the company's terrified employees. I watched a leaked stream of it from my apartment. He stood at a podium, his face flushed with anger, and dismissed my legally irrefutable claim as a frivolous and desperate negotiating tactic from a disgruntled former employee. He tried to paint me as an unstable, vindictive woman, scorned and lashing out. But his words, usually so persuasive, rang hollow in the charged atmosphere of panic. The investors, the cold-eyed men of capital who had received Evelyn's meticulously prepared and utterly terrifying letter, complete with certified copies of the Catalyst patent, the signed funding agreement, and a detailed projection of potential infringement damages, were not convinced by his theatrical bluster. Their own high-priced legal teams, working through the night in a state of frantic panic, had all come to the same horrifying conclusion. The Eden Clause was not just real. It was an ironclad, perfectly executed legal masterstroke. Veridian did not own its core technology. The company, which just days before had been the darling of the green tech world, was a hollow shell, a fraudulent enterprise selling a revolutionary product it had absolutely no right to make. The final, inevitable confrontation came a week later. It did not take place in a sterile, impersonal courtroom, but back in the very same boardroom where I had been so callously and efficiently betrayed. This time, however, the power dynamic, the very energy in the room, had been fundamentally and irrevocably inverted. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, in the seat of power that Arthur Vance had once occupied. By my side was Evelyn Reed, radiating an aura of serene, predatory confidence. Across the polished expanse of wood sat a pale, visibly shaken Julian, his face aged a decade in a week. He was flanked by a team of 3 elite corporate lawyers from a top-tier San Francisco firm. They radiated an almost visible aura of desperation. The board of directors had, in a rare act of collective self-preservation, unanimously voted to bar Arthur Vance from the meeting. His brand of arrogant denial was a liability they could no longer afford. "This is nothing short of corporate sabotage, Ms. Townsend," one of the lawyers began, his voice attempting a stern, authoritative tone that was completely undermined by the frantic, sleepless anxiety in his eyes. "You are intentionally and maliciously destroying the very company you helped to build." Evelyn laughed. It wasn't a sound of humor or mirth. It was a sharp, dismissive crack, like a whip, that cut through the thick tension in the room. "Let be perfectly clear, gentlemen," she said, her voice as cold and hard as the glass wall behind her. "Your clients destroyed this company the moment they conspired to commit willful patent infringement on a massive, global scale. My client is not the aggressor here. She is simply protecting her legally owned and extremely valuable private property from blatant theft." Julian finally looked at me then, his gaze direct for the first time since that terrible morning. His face was a ravaged mask of utter desperation and a dawning, soul-crushing regret that seemed to physically pain him. "Myra, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking, the sound of a man broken. "What is it you want? Is it money? We can make you wealthy beyond your wildest dreams. Do you want your old job back? The lab is yours, just name your price. We will make it happen." This was the moment. The culmination of months of patient, painful, meticulous planning. The moment to unveil the true purpose of my campaign. And it was not what anyone in that room, least of all Julian, expected. "I don't want your money, Julian," I said, and my voice was steady and clear, cleansed of the burning rage that had fueled me for so long. In its place was a cold, resolute calm, the calm of a surgeon about to make a precise incision. "The money is tainted. And I would never work for this corrupted version of Viridian. What I want is something you value far more than money, your reputation. I want a full, public admission of guilt. I want you to stand before the press, before your investors, and before the employees you lied to, and I want you to tell them the unvarnished truth. That you and Arthur Vance conspired to push me out in order to steal my founding equity, and that the entire billion-dollar valuation of this company rests on a single invention you tried and failed to take from me." A horrified, profound silence filled the room. It was so complete I could hear the faint hum of the building's air conditioning. For a man like Julian, whose entire identity, whose very sense of self, was built upon his reputation as a wise, benevolent titan of industry, this demand for public humiliation was a fate far worse than mere bankruptcy. It was a corporate death sentence. And that, I continued, leaning forward, my eyes locked on his, ensuring he understood the full scope of his defeat, is not all. I paused, letting the weight of his predicament settle upon him. "I am not going to sell my pat to your competitors, though I must tell you, the offers I have received in the last week from companies in Germany and Japan have been truly extraordinary. Instead, I am establishing a new, non-profit entity. It will be called the Townsend Foundation for Sustainable Architecture." I slid a new, impeccably drafted legal document across the polished surface of the table. It slid to a stop directly in front of Julian. "I am prepared to license the Catalyst technology back to Viridian Structures. The licensing fee will be a symbolic $1 per year. In return," I said, letting the words hang in the air like suspended weights, "Viridian will be legally and permanently restructured. A new clause will be added to the corporate charter. 20% of all annual pre-tax profits will be donated directly to the foundation. Those funds will be used exclusively to design and build carbon-neutral housing, schools, and hospitals in developing nations and in areas critically affected by climate change. Furthermore," I added, my gaze unflinching, "you and Arthur Vance will resign from all positions, executive and advisory, effective immediately. You will both forfeit your remaining shares to the company's employee stock ownership plan to be distributed among the people who actually do the work here." The lawyers sputtered, their mouths opening and closing like beached fish, unable to formulate a response to such an unorthodox proposal. Julian looked as if he had been physically struck, the last vestiges of color draining from his face. My plan was now brutally clear to them. I was not destroying the company. I was cleansing it. I was performing radical surgery, cutting out the cancerous greed that had taken root in its heart. I was forcing it, under the absolute penalty of total obliteration, to become the company I had always dreamed it could be. A powerful, innovative force for good in the world, not just a soulless machine for generating obscene wealth for a select, privileged few. Faced with the stark, binary choice between total, immediate, and litigious annihilation on one hand, and a chance for corporate survival and perhaps even a sliver of redemption on the other, the board of directors, when presented with my terms, did not take long to decide. They accepted every single condition. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of managed chaos and corporate restructuring. Julian Croft and Arthur Vance vanished from the corporate world, their careers and reputations deservedly in tatters, cautionary tales whispered in the boardrooms they once dominated. Viridian, now under new leadership drawn from its original, dedicated engineering teams and governed by a new, more ethical charter, began the slow, difficult, but ultimately rewarding process of rebuilding its brand and its soul. I never set foot in the Viridian lab again. To do so would have felt like visiting a ghost. My new office was a small, bustling, wonderfully chaotic space in a repurposed warehouse, filled with topographical maps, architectural blueprints for community centers, and a brilliant team of young, idealistic architects and engineers who believed, as I did, that innovation should serve humanity. The Townsend Foundation's first official project was a series of storm-resistant, self-sustaining homes in a coastal village in the Philippines that had been all but wiped off the map by a recent super typhoon. 6 months later, I stood on that dusty construction site on the other side of the world, the warm, salty air of the Pacific on my face. Local children, whose homes had been destroyed, were laughing as they watched the strange, new gray material being poured into the frames of what would soon be their new, safe homes and their new, resilient school. These buildings, built with my bioconcrete, would stand strong. They would be sustainable. They would heal themselves. I watched as a local worker smoothed a patch on a newly set wall, and I imagined the microscopic catalyst agents within, dormant but alive, ready to awaken and heal any future cracks, ready to stand strong against the next storm. My revenge was not a fiery, destructive explosion of corporate ruin. It was a quiet, deliberate, and profoundly satisfying act of creation. I hadn't destroyed Julian's legacy. I had transformed it, redeeming it from his greed and finally, truly, making it my own. I had taken the profound, searing pain of their betrayal and had forged it into a tool for healing, not just for concrete, but for communities and ultimately for myself. The bitterness that had been my constant companion for months was gone, washed away by the tides of purpose, replaced by a deep, grounding sense of peace. I was no longer just the inventor of bioconcrete. I was its steward, its guardian, ensuring that my creation was used not to build gleaming monuments to corporate ego, but to build a better, safer, more hopeful world. And in that, I finally found a success and a sense of healing, far greater and more valuable than any billion-dollar valuation could ever be.